Dr. Marcus Rivera had been working at St. Mary's Hospital for 15 years, but he had never experienced anything like the chaos that erupted on that Tuesday morning in March. The emergency sirens wailed through the corridors as armed militants stormed into the building, their heavy boots echoing against the polished floors. Marcus was in the middle of checking on Mrs. Chen, an elderly patient recovering from heart surgery, when the first gunshots rang out. The sound sent ice through his veins. He had heard about hospital attacks in war zones on the news, but never imagined it could happen in their peaceful city. "Everyone stay calm," he whispered to the patients in the cardiac wing, though his own hands were trembling. The hospital's security system had been compromised, and the emergency lockdown wasn't working properly. Through the windows, he could see black vehicles surrounding the building. Among the medical staff trying to maintain order was a woman he had noticed several times over the past few weeks. She was new to the hospital, always dressed in simple scrubs, carrying herself with a quiet confidence that most nurses developed after years on the job. Her name tag read Sarah Collins, and she worked the night shifts in the emergency department. What struck Marcus as odd was how she seemed to appear wherever she was needed most. When a patient coded, she was already there with the crash cart. When family members became hysterical, she had a way of calming them with just a few words. But there was something else about her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The first group of militants reached their floor within minutes. Marcus counted at least 8 men, all heavily armed and wearing tactical gear. They were shouting orders in a language he didn't recognize, but their intentions were clear. They wanted to take control of the hospital and use the patients as leverage. "All medical staff, hands where we can see them," one of the militants barked in heavily accented English. His face was covered with a black mask, and his eyes were cold and calculating. Marcus raised his hands slowly, positioning himself between the gunman and Mrs. Chen's bed. Around him, other doctors and nurses were doing the same, forming human shields around their most vulnerable patients. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might give him away. That's when he noticed Sarah. She was standing near the nurse's station, her hands raised like everyone else, but there was something different about her posture. While the rest of them were clearly terrified, she seemed almost calm. Her eyes were moving systematically around the room, taking in details that Marcus couldn't even begin to process. The militant leader was a tall man with a scarred face visible above his tactical vest. He gestured with his rifle toward the patients. "These people are now under our protection," he announced mockingly. "Anyone who tries to leave or call for help will be shot." Marcus felt sick to his stomach. The patients in this wing were some of the most critical cases in the hospital. Mrs. Chen had just undergone major surgery. Mr. Rodriguez was on life support after a massive stroke. These people needed constant medical attention, not to be caught in the middle of some terrorist operation. "Please," Marcus found himself saying, stepping forward despite the guns pointed at him. "These patients need immediate medical care. Whatever you want, you can have it. But let us continue treating them." The scarred man turned his attention to Marcus, and the doctor immediately regretted speaking up. "You think you give orders here?" The militant's English was broken, but his meaning was crystal clear. He raised his rifle toward Marcus's chest, but before he could say anything else, there was a commotion from the emergency stairwell. More militants were arriving, this time with what looked like explosives and communication equipment. Marcus realized with growing horror that this wasn't just a random attack. These people had planned this operation carefully. "Sir," one of the new arrivals called out to the leader, "the main building is secure. We have control of the emergency department and the surgical floors. No police response yet, but they will come." The leader nodded grimly. "Good. Set up the communication center in the main lobby. I want all entrances monitored. Kill anyone who tries to enter without permission." Sarah was still standing quietly by the nurse's station, but Marcus noticed her eyes were now focused on something specific. Following her gaze, he saw she was looking at a supply closet near the back of the ward. It seemed like an odd thing to be thinking about in the middle of a hostage situation. The militants began organizing themselves with military precision. They placed guards at all the entrances to the ward and started moving equipment into strategic positions. Marcus realized they were preparing for a long siege. All medical staff will continue working, the leader announced. But you will report everything to us first. Any patient who dies, any equipment that fails, you tell us immediately. We want these people alive and healthy for now. Marcus exchanged glances with Dr. Patricia Williams, the head of the cardiac unit. They both understood the implications. The militants wanted the patients alive because they were more valuable as hostages that way. But keeping critically ill people stable during a siege would be nearly impossible. As the hours passed, the situation became increasingly tense. The militants had cut most of the power to conserve the hospital's backup generators, leaving only essential medical equipment running. The corridors were dimly lit, and the normal sounds of a functioning hospital had been replaced by the whispered conversations of armed guards. Sarah continued to move quietly through the ward, checking on patients and assisting with medical procedures. But Marcus began to notice other things about her behavior. She seemed to know exactly where every piece of equipment was located, even in areas where she shouldn't have been familiar with the layout. When one of the monitors started beeping, she was already adjusting settings before the other nurses even realized there was a problem. More importantly, he saw her having brief, seemingly casual conversations with other medical staff. But there was something purposeful about these interactions, as if she was gathering information or giving instructions. Marcus started to suspect that Sarah Collins might not be exactly who she appeared to be. The first real test came when Mr. Rodriguez's condition started deteriorating rapidly. His blood pressure was dropping, and the ventilator settings needed immediate adjustment. Marcus was working frantically to stabilize him when Sarah appeared at his side. "Dr. Rivera," she said quietly, "I need you to trust me for a moment. Keep working on the patient. But listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you." Something in her voice made Marcus look up from the monitors. For just a second, he saw something in Sarah's eyes that definitely didn't belong on a hospital nurse. It was the look of someone who had seen combat. Someone who had made life and death decisions under extreme pressure. "There are 45 hostiles in the building," she whispered, her hands still working efficiently on Mr. Rodriguez's IV line. "They have the main entrances covered. But there are weaknesses in their positioning. In approximately 30 minutes, I'm going to need you and the other medical staff to get all the patients as low as possible and away from the windows." Marcus stared at her in shock. "How do you know how many there are? And what are you planning to do? Why? Are really have a den off? Televin with you planning. Are really have a den off you are really have a den off. Are really have a den off you Televin with you comment. Are really have a den off to den off you comment. Are really have a den off to den off you comment. Are really have a Sarah's expression didn't change, but her voice became even quieter. "My name isn't really Sarah Collins, and I'm not really a nurse." Marcus felt his world shift as Sarah's words sank in. "What do you mean you're not really a nurse?" he whispered back, his hands still working automatically on Mr. Rodriguez's treatment. "My real name is Captain Sarah Mitchell. United States Army Special Forces," she replied, never taking her eyes off the patient's vital signs. "I've been undercover here for 3 weeks, following intelligence about a possible attack on civilian infrastructure." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. "You knew this was going to happen?" "We knew something was being planned, but not the specifics or the timing," Sarah explained quietly. "The group responsible has been targeting hospitals and schools across the region. This hospital was on their list, but we didn't know when they would strike." Marcus looked around the ward with new eyes. The militants were positioned exactly as Sarah had described, with clear sight lines to all the entrances but blind spots near the service areas. "So, what's the plan? Are there other agents here?" Sarah shook her head. "I'm alone. My backup team is 40 minutes out. But these patients can't wait that long. Mr. Rodriguez will go into cardiac arrest within the hour if we don't get proper power restored to his equipment. Mrs. Chen's surgical site is showing signs of infection that requires immediate antibiotic treatment." The weight of the situation began to settle on Marcus's shoulders. 45 armed terrorists, and it's just you? "I've handled worse odds," Sarah said matter-of-factly. But I need your help to keep the patients safe while I work." Over the next few minutes, Sarah quietly moved through the ward, speaking to each member of the medical staff. To Dr. Williams, she gave instructions about moving the most critical patients to interior rooms. To the respiratory therapist, she explained how to manually operate the ventilators if the power was cut. To each nurse, she provided specific tasks that would keep them busy and away from the areas where she planned to operate. Marcus watched in amazement as the medical staff began following her instructions without question. Despite her deception about being a nurse, there was something about Sarah's authority that inspired immediate trust and confidence. "The leader of this group is Dmitry Volkov," Sarah explained to Marcus as they moved Mrs. Chen to a safer location. "He's a former Russian Special Forces operator who's been conducting terrorist operations for the highest bidder. His team is well trained, but they have one major weakness." "What's that?" "They're overconfident. They think they're dealing with civilian medical staff and local police. They're not expecting military resistance. They're fast permensions." Sarah had somehow acquired a tablet computer and was showing Marcus a schematic of the hospital. "I've been mapping their positions for the last 2 hours. They have teams of 3 to 4 men controlling each critical area, with the command center set up in the main lobby as planned. A loverzo. The tablet showed red dots marking each known terrorist position, with notes about their weapons and patrol patterns. Marcus was astounded by the level of detail she had gathered while appearing to simply do her nursing duties. "How did you get all this information?" "Training and observation," Sarah replied. "Plus, I planted some surveillance devices during my weeks here. The night shift gave me access to areas of the hospital most people never see." Marcus was about to ask more questions when alarms began blaring throughout the building. The militants' leader's voice came over the hospital's intercom system. "Attention all medical staff. We have detected unauthorized movement in the service areas. Anyone found outside their designated positions will be executed immediately. You have 5 minutes to return to your assigned locations." Sarah's expression hardened. "They found one of my surveillance devices. We need to move now." "Move where? What are you going to do?" "I'm going to eliminate the threat," Sarah said simply, "starting with the communication center, then working my way through their defensive positions." Marcus grabbed her arm. "You can't take on 45 armed men by yourself. That's suicide." Sarah looked at him with eyes that held no doubt or fear. "Dr. Rivera, in Afghanistan I once held off an entire Taliban company for 6 hours, with nothing but a sniper rifle and a radio. In Syria, my team eliminated a terrorist cell that had been operating for months without losing a single civilian. This is what I do." She pulled something from a hidden pocket in her scrubs. It looked like a small electronic device. "This will jam their communications for approximately 10 minutes once I activate it. During that time, they won't be able to coordinate their response." "But how are you going to fight them? You don't even have weapons." Sarah smiled for the first time since Marcus had known her. It wasn't the gentle smile of a caring nurse, but the confident grin of a professional soldier. "Doctor, I've been preparing for 3 weeks. This hospital has more potential weapons than you might think." She led him to the supply closet she had been observing earlier. Inside, behind boxes of medical supplies, was a collection of items that definitely didn't belong in a hospital. Military-grade communication equipment, tactical gear, and what appeared to be several firearms. "How did you get all this in here?" "Piece by piece, over several weeks," Sarah explained as she quickly changed into tactical clothing. "The night janitor, Tom Martinez, is actually Sergeant Martinez from my unit. The new maintenance worker, Jake, is Corporal Thompson. We've been staging equipment throughout the building." Marcus felt like he was in a dream. The quiet hospital where he had worked for 15 years had been transformed into a battlefield. And the gentle nurse he thought he knew was actually a highly trained Special Forces operative. "Your job is to keep the medical staff and patients safe," Sarah continued, strapping on body armor. "Get everyone into the interior rooms I showed you. Use the manual override codes I gave Dr. Williams to lock the doors. Don't come out until you hear 3 short blasts on the intercom system followed by 2 long ones. That will be my all-clear signal. She handed Marcus a radio. If something goes wrong, if you see militants getting close to the patient areas, use Channel 7 to contact my backup team. Tell them, Code Red Phoenix, and give them your exact location. As Sarah finished her preparations, Marcus realized he was witnessing a transformation. The woman who had spent weeks caring for patients with gentle hands and a soft voice was now checking weapons with the practiced efficiency of a career soldier. How many people are you really planning to take on alone? He asked one more time. 45, Sarah replied without hesitation. But I won't be fighting them all at once. Military tactics are about using superior positioning and timing to engage smaller groups. I'll take out their communications first, then their leadership, then work through their defensive positions systematically. The lights in the hospital suddenly went out completely, leaving only the red emergency lighting. Sarah activated her jamming device, and Marcus could hear shouting in the distance as the militants realized they had lost radio contact with each other. This is it, Sarah said, moving toward the door. Remember, keep everyone safe and wait for my signal. As she slipped out of the supply closet, Marcus caught a glimpse of the tactical gear she was carrying. Night vision goggles, a suppressed rifle, and various other equipment he didn't recognize. For a moment, he questioned whether he was doing the right thing by trusting her, but then he thought about Mrs. Chen, who needed immediate medical attention, and Mr. Rodriguez, whose life depended on equipment that was already starting to fail. He thought about all the other patients in the hospital who were depending on the medical staff to keep them alive. Sarah had spent 3 weeks caring for these patients with the same dedication as any nurse he had ever worked with. Whatever else she was someone who put the lives of innocent people first. Marcus gathered the other medical staff and began implementing Sarah's plan to protect the patients. As he worked, he could hear distant sounds that suggested Sarah had begun her mission. The question now was whether one Special Forces operative, no matter how skilled, could really take on an entire terrorist organization and win. Outside the patient rooms, the hospital had become a war zone. And somewhere in that darkness, the woman they had all thought was just a nurse was hunting 45 armed enemies who had no idea what was coming for them. The first sign that Sarah had begun her operation came 20 minutes after she left the supply closet. Marcus was helping Dr. Williams move the last of the critical care patients to the secure interior rooms when they heard a muffled explosion from somewhere below them. What was that? Dr. Williams whispered, her face pale in the emergency lighting. Marcus checked the radio Sarah had given him, but there was only static. Either her jamming device was still active, or something had gone wrong. Through the thick walls, they could hear shouting and running footsteps as the militants tried to figure out what had happened. In the basement level of the hospital, Sarah was moving through the mechanical rooms with deadly precision. Her first target had been the communications center the terrorists had established near the main electrical systems. Using explosives she had planted weeks earlier, she had destroyed their primary radio equipment and backup generators simultaneously. The explosion had killed 3 militants instantly and left the remaining terrorist forces blind and unable to coordinate. But Sarah knew the advantage would only last as long as it took them to regroup and establish visual contact with each other. Moving through the hospital's service corridors, she used her night vision equipment to navigate in complete darkness, while the militants stumbled around with flashlights. Her weeks of preparation had given her an intimate knowledge of every shortcut, every hidden passage, and every structural weakness in the building. The second phase of her operation targeted the terrorist leadership. She had identified Dmitry Volkov's command post in the main lobby, where he was directing operations with his lieutenant and 4 bodyguards. Using the hospital's ventilation system, Sarah positioned herself directly above their location. Volkov was shouting orders in Russian, trying to understand what had happened to his communications. His men were spread throughout the lobby, checking windows and entrances for signs of an assault that they assumed must be coming from outside. Sarah dropped through a ceiling tile directly behind 2 of the guards. Her suppressed rifle took out both men before they could raise an alarm. She moved like a shadow, using the lobby's reception desk and medical equipment as cover, while she systematically eliminated Volkov's protection. The terrorist leader realized he was under attack when his lieutenant suddenly collapsed beside him. He spun around, trying to locate the threat, but Sarah was already moving to a new position. Years of combat experience had taught her that the key to surviving overwhelming odds was never staying in one place long enough for the enemy to target her. "Ghost. We have a ghost in the building." Volkov screamed into his dead radio, not understanding that his communication systems were destroyed. In the darkness and chaos, his remaining men couldn't tell where the shots were coming from. By the time Volkov and his last bodyguard realized they were the only ones left alive in the lobby, Sarah had already moved on to her next targets. She left Volkov alive deliberately, knowing that a leader cut off from his forces would make increasingly desperate decisions that would work in her favor. The third phase involved the terrorist teams stationed throughout the hospital's upper floors. Sarah used the building's elevator shafts and stairwells to move between levels, appearing behind enemy positions that were designed to watch for attacks from the corridors. On the surgical floor, a team of 4 militants had barricaded themselves in the operating rooms, using the expensive medical equipment as cover. They had no way of knowing that Sarah was approaching through the surgical suite's sterilization area, which connected to the operating rooms through service doors they didn't even know existed. She eliminated the first guard silently, using a knife rather than her rifle to avoid alerting the others. The second guard found his partner's body and raised the alarm, just as Sarah's shots took out the remaining 2 men. The entire engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. In the pediatric ward, Sarah faced her most challenging opponents yet. The terrorist team stationed there had taken positions that gave them clear sight lines to all approaches, and they were using the hospital's young patients as human shields. Sarah knew that any mistake here could result in the deaths of innocent children. Using smoke grenades and her night vision advantage, she created a confusion that allowed her to move close enough to each terrorist position to take precise shots. Her military training had prepared her for exactly this type of situation, where civilian casualties were absolutely unacceptable. One by one, the militants in the pediatric ward fell to her carefully aimed shots. The children, terrified and confused, remained safely in their beds as Sarah moved through the ward like a protective spirit, eliminating the threats around them without disturbing their hiding places. By this point, the remaining terrorists throughout the hospital were beginning to panic. They had lost contact with their leadership, their communication systems were down, and their forces were disappearing one by one. Some began abandoning their positions to look for their missing teammates, which only made them easier targets for Sarah's systematic assault. In the emergency department, 6 militants had fortified themselves behind overturned gurneys and medical carts. They were firing blindly into the darkness, trying to hit an enemy they couldn't see or locate. Sarah used their muzzle flashes to pinpoint their exact positions, then systematically eliminated them from an elevated position in the department's observation deck. The psychiatric ward presented a different challenge, as the terrorists there had realized they were under attack and had begun executing a more defensive strategy. They had gathered in a central location and were waiting for the assault they were sure was coming. Sarah decided to use their expectations against them. Instead of attacking their defensive position directly, she created diversions in other parts of the hospital that drew some of them away from their stronghold. When they split their forces to investigate the sounds of combat from other areas, she was able to take them out in smaller groups. As the night wore on, the number of active terrorists in the hospital continued to decrease. Sarah had eliminated more than half of their original force, and the survivors were becoming increasingly desperate and disorganized. In the cardiac wing where Marcus was still protecting the patients, they could hear the sounds of fighting getting closer. The radio Sarah had given him suddenly crackled to life. "Dr. Rivera, this is Mitchell. I need you to keep everyone in the secure rooms for another 30 minutes. There are still hostile forces on your level, but I'm moving to eliminate them now." Marcus grabbed the radio. "Sarah, are you all right? We heard explosions and gunfire." "I'm fine, doctor. The operation is proceeding according to plan. Just keep the patients safe for a little longer." The final confrontation came when Sarah reached the intensive care unit, where Dmitry Volkov had retreated with the last 12 members of his team. They had barricaded themselves among the critical care patients, using the most vulnerable people in the hospital as protection. Volkov had finally figured out that he wasn't facing a police assault or military intervention from outside. He was being hunted by a single operative who had been hiding among the hospital staff for weeks. The realization filled him with rage and desperation. "I know you're listening," he called out into the darkness, speaking in English. "Whoever you are, I have patients on life support. If you come any closer, I'll start disconnecting their machines." Sarah's voice came from somewhere in the darkness around them. "Mr. Volkov, your operation has failed. Your forces have been eliminated. Surrender now, and the patients won't be harmed." "Show yourself," Volkov screamed. "Fight me like a soldier." "I am fighting like a soldier," Sarah replied. "I'm completing my mission to protect innocent lives." The final engagement was swift and decisive. Using her knowledge of the ICU's layout and equipment, Sarah created a diversion that drew Volkov's attention, while she eliminated his remaining men from multiple angles. When the shooting stopped, Volkov found himself alone among the critical care patients, facing a woman in military gear who had just single-handedly destroyed his entire operation. "Please," Volkov said, dropping his weapon. "I surrender." Sarah kept her rifle trained on him as she moved to check on the patients. "You should have surrendered before you threatened civilian lives." 45 minutes after the hospital's communication systems went down, the emergency intercom crackled to life. 3 short blasts followed by 2 long ones echoed through the building. Marcus unlocked the door to the secure room where he had been protecting Mrs. Chen and the other patients. In the hallway, Sarah was waiting for them, still in her tactical gear but with the gentle expression they remembered from her time as a nurse. "It's over," she said simply. "The hospital is secure. My backup team is arriving now to handle cleanup and investigations." Mrs. Chen looked up at Sarah with confusion and gratitude. "You saved us all, didn't you, dear?" Sarah smiled, the same warm smile she had worn while checking vital signs and adjusting IV drips. "Just doing my job, Mrs. Chen. Let's get you back to your regular room. So, Doctor, Rivera can make sure you're recovering properly." As they moved through the hospital corridors, Marcus saw the evidence of the night's battle. The building would need significant repairs, but every single patient had survived. Against impossible odds, one woman had protected an entire hospital full of vulnerable people from a force of trained killers. "Will you be staying?" Marcus asked, as they helped settle the patients back into their regular rooms. Sarah was already changing back into her scrubs. "For a few more days, until we're sure there are no remaining threats. Someone needs to keep an eye on Mrs. Chen's recovery, and Mr. Rodriguez is going to need careful monitoring as he comes off the ventilator." As the sun rose over the city, the hospital slowly returned to normal operations. The news media would report the story as a failed terrorist attack, but they would never know the complete truth about the nurse who had protected 45 patients by neutralizing 45 enemies in a single night. Marcus never forgot the lesson he learned that night. Sometimes heroes come in unexpected forms, and the most extraordinary people are often hiding in plain sight, ready to risk everything to protect those who cannot protect themselves. In his 15 years at St. Mary's Hospital, he had seen many dedicated medical professionals, but he had never met anyone quite like Captain Sarah Mitchell, the woman who proved that being a protector of life can take many different forms.